November 19th, 1943. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi stood in the operations room of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk Lagoon, studying reconnaissance photographs that should have been impossible. The images showed not the massive fleet carriers his intelligence officers had predicted, but something else entirely. Small, boxy vessels with straight flight decks, no island superstructures worth mentioning, and silhouettes that looked more like merchant ships than warships. His intelligence officer, Commander Minoru Genda, had counted 23 of these strange vessels operating off the Gilbert Islands during the American invasion of Tarawa, 23 carriers that hadn't existed in Japanese threat assessments 6 months earlier. "What are these?" Onishi asked, tapping one of the photographs with a wooden pointer. The vessel in the image looked nothing like USS Enterprise or Saratoga, the fleet carriers that had savaged Japanese forces at Midway and in the Solomon Islands. This ship was smaller, simpler, and almost crude in its construction. "The Americans call them CVEs," Genda replied. "Escort carriers, converted merchant hulls. Our initial assessment classified them as auxiliary vessels, not combat units. We believed they were being used solely for aircraft transport and training duties." Onishi studied the photograph more carefully. The flight deck was perhaps 400 feet long, maybe 450 at most. The hull showed riveted construction typical of mass-produced merchant ships, not the sleek welded hulls of purpose-built warships. There was no armor belt visible, no heavy gun mounts, nothing suggesting this vessel could survive combat against anything more threatening than a submarine. "How many aircraft does one of these carry?" Onishi asked. "Between 24 and 28, Genda said. "Mostly fighters and torpedo bombers configured for ground attack missions." The numbers seemed insignificant. A fleet carrier like Shokaku embarked 72 aircraft. These escort carriers carried barely a third of that. Yet there were 23 of them supporting a single amphibious operation. That meant roughly 550 aircraft, equivalent to 7 or 8 fleet carriers, delivered by vessels that looked like they'd been built in automobile factories. Onishi felt the first stirring of something he'd later recognize as professional dread. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 years engaging American fleet carriers in decisive battles, trading blows in the Coral Sea, at Midway, in the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. Every engagement had been treated as potentially decisive, capable of shifting the Pacific War's entire trajectory. Japanese doctrine emphasized the decisive fleet engagement, the single crushing blow that would destroy enemy naval power and force a negotiated peace. But what if the Americans weren't playing that game anymore? What if instead of building a few powerful fleet carriers to engage in decisive battles, they were building dozens of these cheap, simple escort carriers to flood the Pacific with aircraft? You couldn't sink your way to victory against an enemy who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. How quickly can the Americans build these vessels? Onishi asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Genda consulted his notes. Intelligence estimates between 3 and 6 months from keel laying to commissioning. The vessels are being constructed at Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, using assembly line techniques adapted from automotive manufacturing. Some reports suggest they're launching 1 vessel every week. 1 per week. Onishi did the mathematics in his head. 52 weeks per year meant potentially 50 or more of these vessels entering service annually. Even accounting for construction delays, maintenance requirements, and the time needed to train crews and air groups, the Americans could theoretically deploy 100 escort carriers within 2 years. 100 carriers, each carrying 25 to 30 aircraft. That was 3,000 aircraft, equivalent to 40 fleet carriers by Japanese standards. The comparison wasn't quite accurate, of course. These escort carriers were slower, more vulnerable, less capable in many respects than fleet carriers. But they didn't need to be as capable if you could build 5 of them for the cost of 1 fleet carrier. Naval warfare, Onishi was beginning to realize, wasn't just about the quality of your ships or the skill of your crews. It was increasingly about industrial capacity, about which nation could produce more hulls, more aircraft, more trained pilots faster than the enemy could destroy them. Japan had started the Pacific War with 10 aircraft carriers, the finest naval aviation force in the world. By November 1943, 7 of those carriers had been sunk, Kaga and Akagi at Midway, Soryu and Hiryu at Midway, Shoho in the Coral Sea, Ryujo at the Eastern Solomons. Zuikaku would survive until October 1944, but she was increasingly isolated, operating without adequate air groups or supporting vessels. The remaining 3 carriers, Junyo, Hiyo, and the light carrier Zuiho, were stretched impossibly thin trying to defend an empire that sprawled across half the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Against this declining Japanese carrier strength, the Americans were deploying not just fleet carriers, but these escort carriers in numbers that defied every pre-war assumption about naval warfare. The escorts weren't replacing fleet carriers. They were supplementing them, creating a layered naval air capability that could support multiple simultaneous operations across thousands of miles of ocean. Onishi had risen through the ranks as a naval aviator, one of the officers who'd pioneered Japanese carrier doctrine in the 1920s and 30s. He understood intimately how carrier warfare was supposed to work. You concentrated your carrier strength into a single powerful striking force, achieved local air superiority, destroyed the enemy's carriers in decisive engagement, and controlled the sea. It was elegant, efficient, and historically proven. The Imperial Japanese Navy had executed this doctrine flawlessly at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, and in the early months of the Pacific War. But the Americans, it seemed, hadn't read the manual. Or more accurately, they'd read it and decided to write a completely different manual based on industrial mass production rather than naval elegance. They were building carriers the same way they built trucks and tanks and cargo ships, treating them as disposable industrial products rather than irreplaceable capital investments. The escort carrier concept had actually originated with the British Royal Navy, born from the desperate necessity of protecting Atlantic convoys from German U-boats and long-range bombers. In 1941, the British had begun converting merchant ships into small aircraft carriers by adding flight decks and minimal aviation facilities. These vessels, initially called merchant aircraft carriers, or MAC ships, carried just a handful of aircraft, but provided invaluable air cover for convoys traversing the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. The concept was simple and brutally practical. Take a standard merchant hull, either during construction or by converting existing vessels, and add a flight deck. Strip away everything unnecessary. No armor, no heavy armament, minimal crew accommodation, just enough aviation fuel storage and munitions handling capacity to keep aircraft flying for anti-submarine patrols. The resulting vessel was slow, vulnerable, and carried fewer aircraft than a fleet carrier, but it cost a fraction as much to build and required far fewer skilled workers and specialized materials. The Americans had observed British successes with escort carriers and characteristically taken the concept to industrial extremes. In April 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy authorized conversion of a merchant hull into the escort carrier USS Long Island. She was commissioned in June 1942 and proved immediately useful for aircraft transport and anti-submarine operations. But Long Island was just an experiment, a proof of concept. The real transformation began with the Bogue-class and Casablanca-class escort carriers, purpose-built vessels constructed from the keel up as carriers using mass production techniques. The Casablanca-class, designed by Kaiser Shipyards and built in Vancouver, Washington, represented American industrial capability at its most impressive and most terrifying, if you were on the receiving end. Kaiser Shipyards had revolutionized merchant ship construction during the early war years by applying automotive assembly line techniques to shipbuilding. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist with no previous shipbuilding experience, had studied how cars were manufactured on moving assembly lines with interchangeable parts and standardized processes. He'd applied those same principles to constructing Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that became the backbone of Allied logistics. The Casablanca-class escort carriers took Kaiser's methods even further, Each ship was built from prefabricated sections manufactured in different parts of the shipyard simultaneously, then welded together on the ways in a matter of weeks. Engines, boilers, and major equipment were installed as complete units rather than assembled piece by piece. Electrical systems used standardized wiring harnesses. Piping systems were prefabricated. Even furniture and fixtures were mass-produced to identical specifications and installed in batches. The result was a ship that could be completed in an average of 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. Some vessels were built even faster. USS Casablanca, the class's lead ship, went from keel to commissioning in 116 days. The shortest construction time was 86 days for USS Commencement Bay, though she belonged to a later, slightly different class. These weren't handcrafted warships built by skilled artisans in traditional naval shipyards. They were manufactured products built by workers who 6 months earlier had been building cars or working in canneries. The specifications reflected this industrial approach. Casablanca-class carriers displaced 7,800 tons standard, 10,400 tons fully loaded. Length overall was 512 feet, with a flight deck 477 feet long by 80 feet wide. Beam measured 108 feet. Draft was 23 feet. The propulsion system consisted of 2 Skinner Uniflow reciprocating steam engines, a simpler and more easily manufactured alternative to the turbines used in fleet carriers, driving 2 propeller shafts. Maximum speed was 19 knots, adequate for convoy work but far slower than the 30-plus knots fleet carriers could sustain. Armament was minimal. 1 5-inch gun mounted on the stern for surface combat, primarily intended for use against submarines. 16 40mm anti-aircraft guns in twin mounts provided air defense. 20 20mm Oerlikon cannons supplemented the 40s. That was it. No armor belt protected the hull. The flight deck was wooden planks over a steel framework, less than an inch of protection separating aircraft and aviation fuel from incoming shells or bombs. A single torpedo or bomb hit in the wrong place would gut a Casablanca-class carrier from stem to stern. But inadequate protection wasn't really the point. These vessels weren't designed to survive fleet actions against battleships or cruisers. They were designed to be built quickly, operated by minimally trained crews, and replaced easily if lost. Naval architects had calculated that the United States could build approximately 5 escort carriers for the cost of 1 Essex-class fleet carrier. If you lost an escort carrier, you accepted the loss and built another one in 3 months. The industrial capacity to replace loss faster than the enemy could inflict them was itself a form of naval superiority. The air group consisted of 28 aircraft in standard configuration, 9 FM-2 Wildcat fighters, a simplified version of the 4F Wildcat, optimized for production and ground attack. 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers were configured primarily for close air support missions with bombs and rockets rather than torpedoes. 1 Avenger was typically reserved for reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrol duties. The pilots who flew these aircraft were trained primarily for ground support missions, attacking enemy positions ashore, bombing supply dumps, strafing troop concentrations. They received minimal training in fleet action tactics or engaging enemy warships. This was the force multiplier that Japanese admirals initially dismissed as irrelevant. The escort carriers weren't fleet units. They were auxiliaries, support vessels incapable of engaging proper warships. Onishi himself had shared this assessment in 1942, when the first intelligence reports about American escort carrier construction reached Japanese naval headquarters. He'd filed those reports with minimal concern, focused instead on tracking American fleet carriers like Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. By November 1943, Onishi was revising his assessment dramatically. Those 23 escort carriers supporting the Tarawa invasion weren't engaging in fleet actions. They were providing continuous air cover for amphibious landing forces, conducting anti-submarine patrols, delivering close air support for Marines fighting ashore. They were doing all the unglamorous, essential work that allowed an amphibious invasion to succeed, and because there were 23 of them, they could maintain continuous operations around the clock rotating aircraft and pilots, while some carriers rested and rearmed. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized surge capability, the ability to launch massive alpha strikes with coordinated waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. This doctrine had worked brilliantly at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean, where Japanese carriers had launched devastating strikes that overwhelmed enemy defenses through sheer concentrated power. But surge capability required resting your air groups between strikes, recovering aircraft, rearming and refueling them, then launching the next coordinated strike. During those intervals, your carrier had minimal defensive capability and couldn't respond quickly to emerging threats. The American escort carrier approach emphasized sustained operations rather than surge capability. With multiple carriers operating together, you could maintain continuous combat air patrols overhead, launch close air support missions continuously throughout the day, and keep aircraft on station over critical areas without interruption. Individual carriers contributed modest striking power, but collectively they provided a persistent presence that surge capability couldn't match. The difference became apparent during the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943. Japanese defenders on Tarawa and Makin fought with characteristic ferocity, inflicting heavy casualties on attacking Marines. But they did so without any air support whatsoever, because American escort carrier aircraft maintained continuous combat air patrols that made it suicidal for Japanese aircraft to approach. Every attempt by Japanese bombers to attack the invasion fleet was intercepted by Wildcat fighters vectored onto the targets by radar-equipped fighter direction officers aboard the escort carriers. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the escort carriers and their escorts. Meanwhile, Avenger torpedo bombers flying from the escort carriers pounded Japanese defensive positions continuously, dropping 500-pound bombs and firing 5-inch rockets into bunkers and strong points. The bombardment wasn't particularly accurate by later standards, but its persistence wore down Japanese defenders psychologically and materially. You couldn't rest, couldn't maneuver, couldn't organize counterattacks when American aircraft were overhead constantly, ready to strike any movement or concentration of troops. From the Japanese perspective on Tarawa, it must have seemed like the Americans had infinite aircraft. Shoot down one Wildcat and 2 more appeared, destroy one Avenger and 3 more arrived to continue the attack. The reality was simpler. Multiple escort carriers rotating missions meant constant coverage without the gaps that characterized fleet carrier operations. Admiral Onishi understood he was witnessing a fundamental transformation in naval warfare, from battles between individual powerful units to attrition warfare conducted by mass-produced industrial products. It was the naval equivalent of what had happened on the Western Front in World War I, when machine guns and barbed wire had made individual heroism largely irrelevant compared to industrial capacity to produce ammunition, replacement troops, and supplies. Japan had begun the Pacific War with superior aircraft, better trained pilots, and more experienced carrier forces. But by late 1943, those advantages were eroding under the weight of American industrial production. Japanese pilots who died couldn't be replaced at the same rate Americans could train new pilots. Japanese carriers that sunk couldn't be replaced at all. Japanese aircraft loss, whether from combat or operational accidents, created permanent gaps in air group strength. The Americans were losing aircraft at comparable or higher rates in absolute numbers, but they were replacing those losses faster than they occurred. More importantly, they were training replacement pilots faster than they lost experienced ones, gradually building an ever larger pool of trained naval aviators. And they were doing all this while simultaneously building escort carriers that, individually, were inferior to Japanese fleet carriers, but collectively overwhelming in their numbers and persistence. The strategic implications were devastating for Japan. Pre-war planning had assumed roughly equal naval strengths, with victory going to the side that achieved better concentration of forces at the decisive point. But what happened when one side could be present everywhere simultaneously because they had 50 carriers to your 3? You couldn't concentrate against an enemy who was already concentrated at every threatened point. Worse, the escort carriers liberated American fleet carriers for offensive operations. In 1942, American fleet carriers had been stretched impossibly thin, trying to protect multiple threatened areas simultaneously. They'd had to cover convoy routes, defend against Japanese raids, and support amphibious operations. By late 1943, escort carriers were handling convoy protection and amphibious support, freeing fleet carriers to hunt Japanese naval forces and conduct offensive strikes against Japanese-held islands. The numbers told a story that Japanese naval planners found increasingly difficult to ignore. By the end of World War II, the United States had built 122 escort carriers, with 50 of the Casablanca class commissioned between July 1943 and July 1944. That meant one new escort carrier entering service every 7 days for an entire year. The industrial achievement was staggering, representing a level of productive capacity that Japan simply could not match or counter. By mid-1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had transformed completely from what Japanese admirals had predicted in 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had started the war with 10 aircraft carriers and the world's most experienced naval aviation force, had been reduced to a hollow shell. Most of the experienced pilots who'd attacked Pearl Harbor and ravaged Allied forces across the Pacific in early 1942 were dead, their aircraft shot down over the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, or the Philippine Sea. The remaining carriers either sat in port for lack of fuel or operated with air groups so inexperienced that many pilots could barely land on a carrier deck safely. Against this declining Japanese capability, the Americans deployed not just their rebuilt fleet carrier force, but wave after wave of escort carriers that appeared everywhere simultaneously. In the Marianas invasion during June 1944, American forces deployed 15 fleet and light carriers supported by 18 escort carriers. The escort carriers provided continuous air support for the amphibious landings on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, while the fleet carriers engaged the Japanese mobile fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The division of labor was perfect and would have been impossible without the escort carriers' numbers. The engagement that most dramatically illustrated the escort carriers' value came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, specifically during the action off Samar on the morning of October 25th. This battle, covered in detail in one of your inspiration videos, demonstrated that escort carriers could not only support amphibious operations, but could, when necessary, defend themselves against overwhelming surface attack through sheer determination and the courage of their escorts. 18 escort carriers participated in the 5-day Battle of Leyte Gulf, with 14 of them built at Kaiser shipyards. These vessels, organized into 3 task units designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, provided air cover for General Douglas MacArthur's invasion of Leyte Island in the Philippines. When Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force unexpectedly appeared off Samar, having transited the San Bernardino Strait unopposed, the escort carriers of Taffy 3 found themselves facing 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers with nothing but their own aircraft, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts for protection. The resulting battle became legendary not because the escort carriers won through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but because they survived and accomplished their mission despite facing impossible odds. The carriers launched every available aircraft, armed with whatever ordnance happened to be loaded, including depth charges meant for submarines. They made repeated attacks against Japanese battleships and cruisers, forcing the enemy force to maneuver defensively and disrupting their attack coordination. Meanwhile, the destroyers and destroyer escorts made suicidal torpedo runs that crippled several Japanese cruisers and convinced Admiral Kurita he faced much more powerful opposition than actually existed. USS Gambier Bay became the only American fleet or light carrier sunk by surface gunfire during World War II when she went down under concentrated fire from Japanese cruisers. USS Saint-Lô became the first major American warship sunk by a kamikaze attack later that same day. The losses were painful, but Taffy 3 had accomplished something remarkable. Through courage and determination, 6 escort carriers and 7 small warships had turned back the most powerful Japanese surface force remaining in the war, preventing it from reaching the vulnerable invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. Kurita, watching wave after wave of American aircraft attacking his force, became convinced he faced fleet carriers rather than the escort carriers he'd been briefed about. The ferocity and persistence of the attacks seemed impossible from such small vessels. When combined with the aggressive destroyer attacks and his own exhaustion from nearly drowning when his previous flagship was torpedoed, Kurita made the decision to withdraw northward, abandoning his mission to destroy the American invasion fleet. That decision, controversial among historians to this day, reflected a broader Japanese failure to adapt to the new reality of naval warfare. Japanese doctrine still emphasized decisive fleet engagements between capital ships, the kind of climactic battles where superior training and fighting spirit might overcome material disadvantages. But the Americans weren't offering that kind of battle. They were grinding Japanese forces down through attrition, replacing every loss with 3 new ships, every lost pilot with 5 trained replacements, every destroyed aircraft with 10 fresh from the factory. The escort carriers were the physical manifestation of this attritional strategy. They weren't meant to win decisive victories in single dramatic engagements. They were meant to be everywhere, providing constant pressure, supporting multiple simultaneous operations, and making it impossible for Japanese forces to concentrate against any single threat. When Japanese commanders destroyed one escort carrier, 2 more appeared to take its place. When Japanese aircraft managed to damage a task unit of escort carriers, another task unit was already operating 50 miles away, unaffected by the attack. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The operational flexibility that escort carriers provided proved equally valuable. Because they were built on merchant hull designs and operated by partially civilian crews in some cases, they could perform missions that fleet carriers couldn't economically undertake. They ferried replacement aircraft from the United States to forward bases, carrying dozens of fighters and bombers as cargo rather than as operational aircraft. They served as training carriers, qualifying new pilots in carrier landing techniques before those pilots reported to fleet carriers. They provided air cover for logistics convoys, the unglamorous but essential task of protecting the supply ships that kept American forces fed, fueled, and armed. In the Atlantic theater, escort carriers proved equally indispensable for convoy protection against German U-boats. The mid-Atlantic gap, that vast stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, had been a killing zone for Allied merchant shipping in 1942 and early 1943. U-boats operated with relative impunity, surfacing to attack convoys that had no air cover. The introduction of escort carriers to convoy escort duty transformed the situation completely. A single escort carrier with a dozen aircraft could provide air cover for an entire convoy, forcing U-boats to remain submerged where they were slow and nearly blind. Aircraft equipped with radar could detect surfaced submarines at night or in poor visibility, directing escort destroyers to attack. The mere presence of an escort carrier often deterred U-boat attacks entirely. As submarine commanders knew they faced long odds attacking a protected convoy, the Battle of the Atlantic, which had threatened Britain's survival in early 1943, turned decisively in the Allies' favour partly because escort carriers made it prohibitively dangerous for U-boats to operate against protected convoys. The statistical evidence of escort carrier effectiveness was overwhelming. Allied forces produced 121 escort carriers during the war, of which 10 were sunk. That represented a loss rate of roughly 8%, far lower than the loss rates for destroyers or submarines, and comparable to fleet carrier loss rates. The relatively low losses reflected partly the escort carriers' typical employment in less risky operations compared to fleet carriers, but also reflected the effectiveness of their air groups and escorts in defending them. In contrast, Japan produced only 5 escort carriers during the war, all of which were sunk. The disparity wasn't just numerical. Japanese escort carriers were larger and faster than their American counterparts in some cases, but they lacked catapults and arresting gear in some designs and were used almost exclusively for aircraft transport and training rather than combat operations. More critically, Japanese escort carriers operated without the protective screen of escorts and support vessels that American escort carriers enjoyed. Japanese submarines attacked the carriers in 8 separate attacks, ultimately sinking all 3 vessels of the Taiyo class by 1944. The contrast illustrated a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached naval warfare. Americans treated ships as tools, industrial products that performed specific functions and could be replaced when lost. The Japanese treated ships as extensions of warrior spirit, irreplaceable assets that embodied national prestige and fighting capability. When an American escort carrier was sunk, it was a tactical setback that would be remedied by building more carriers. When a Japanese carrier was sunk, it represented a permanent diminishment of national power that couldn't be recovered. This philosophical difference extended to how each navy trained and employed its personnel. American escort carrier crews received standardized training at dedicated facilities. Damage control was emphasized heavily, with every sailor cross-trained on multiple stations and regular drills conducted to ensure crews could respond effectively to combat damage. The investment in training paid dividends at Samar and in numerous other engagements where American ships survived damage that should have been fatal, kept fighting through skilled damage control, and limped back to port for repairs. Japanese naval training emphasized offensive spirit and aggressive tactics, but devoted less attention to damage control and defensive operations. When Japanese ships took damage, their crews often lacked the training and equipment to contain fires, control flooding, or restore power to critical systems. Ships that might have been saved with better damage control were abandoned or sank because crews couldn't stop the damage from cascading through the vessel. The material quality of American ships also reflected industrial capacity advantages. Escort carriers, despite their reputation as Kaiser coffins and jokes that CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, were actually reasonably well-built vessels for their intended purpose. They had adequate compartmentation to contain flooding from torpedo hits. Their fire suppression systems, while basic, were effective when properly used. Their damage control equipment, from portable pumps to firefighting gear, was standardized and available in sufficient quantities. By late 1944, the escort carrier force had grown to encompass nearly every aspect of naval aviation operations in both theaters. In the Pacific, escort carriers supported the invasions of Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, providing close air support for Marines and soldiers fighting ashore. Their aircraft were spotted for naval gunfire, directing battleship and cruiser fire onto enemy positions with devastating accuracy. They conducted anti-submarine patrols, protecting the massive logistics fleet that kept American forces supplied across thousands of miles of ocean. They served as aircraft transports, ferrying replacement fighters and bombers to forward bases and fleet carriers. In the Atlantic and Mediterranean, escort carriers continued convoy protection duties and supported amphibious operations in southern France and Italy. Their aircraft hunted submarines, protected shipping lanes, and provided air cover for logistics operations. Some escort carriers were assigned to anti-submarine hunter-killer groups, task units built around a single escort carrier, and several destroyers or destroyer escorts that actively hunted U-boats rather than passively protecting convoys. The Japanese response to this overwhelming numerical superiority was increasingly desperate. Unable to match American production, Japanese naval commanders turned to tactics that emphasized individual sacrifice over material efficiency. The Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, introduced at Leyte Gulf, represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. If you couldn't build enough aircraft or train enough pilots to match American numbers through conventional combat, you could maximize the impact of each sortie by deliberately crashing aircraft into enemy ships. Kamikazes proved particularly effective against escort carriers, whose thin decks and lack of armor provided minimal protection against aircraft laden with bombs crashing at high speed. Of the 11 United States aircraft carriers of all types lost during World War II, 6 were escort carriers, 5 of which were Casablanca-class vessels. Several of these losses came from kamikaze attacks in the war's final months, as Japanese desperation intensified. USS Omani Bay was hit by a kamikaze carrying 2 bombs on January 4, 1945, while en route to Lingayen Gulf. The bombs detonated in the hangar deck, starting uncontrollable fires that spread throughout the ship. She was abandoned and scuttled by destroyer escort fire. USS Bismarck C was struck by 2 kamikazes off Iwo Jima on February 21, 1945. The attacks started massive fires that detonated stored ammunition. She sank within hours, taking over 200 men with her. But even kamikaze attacks couldn't stem the tide of American advance. For every escort carrier damaged or sunk, 3 more were available to take its place. The industrial base that produced escort carriers at a rate of 1 per week could absorb losses that would have been crippling to a smaller navy. American shipyards repaired damaged carriers rapidly, returning them to service within weeks or months. Replacement crews were trained and deployed quickly. The system was designed for attrition warfare and excelled at it. The endgame of the Pacific War illustrated how completely escort carriers had transformed American naval capabilities. During the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945, American forces deployed over 40 escort carriers alongside fleet and light carriers. The escort carriers provided continuous combat air patrols, ground support for troops fighting ashore, and anti-kamikaze defense. Their aircraft flew thousands of sorties, maintaining constant pressure on Japanese positions, while simultaneously defending the massive invasion fleet from air attack. The scale of operations would have been impossible without escort carriers. Fleet carriers, with their limited numbers and high operational tempo, needed regular breaks for rearming, refueling, and rest. Escort carriers, operating in large numbers with smaller air groups, could maintain continuous coverage through rotation. While one group rested and rearmed, 2 others maintained operations. The system provided a persistent presence that Japanese forces simply couldn't match or overcome. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the contrast between American and Japanese naval aviation capability was stark beyond measure. The United States Navy operated over 100 escort carriers alongside its fleet and light carriers, providing total embarked aircraft strength exceeding 10,000 operational fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. Japan's surviving carriers, fuel-starved and lacking trained pilots, sat in port as targets awaiting inevitable destruction. The decisive fleet engagement that Japanese doctrine had emphasized never came, because by war's end, there was no Japanese fleet capable of offering meaningful engagement. The escort carrier's role didn't end with Japan's surrender. Many were retained in service for years afterward, performing transport and training duties. Some were converted to helicopter carriers during the Korean War, providing mobile platforms for the new rotary-wing aircraft that would transform amphibious warfare. Others served as aircraft transports during the Vietnam War, ferrying fighters and helicopters to Southeast Asia. The final escort carrier wasn't scrapped until the mid-1960s, over 20 years after the war's end. The strategic lessons from the escort carrier program resonated far beyond World War II. The program demonstrated that numerical superiority achieved through industrial mass production could be more valuable than qualitative superiority in individual platforms. 5 adequate ships that could be built quickly proved more useful than 1 excellent ship that took years to construct. The lesson applied not just to naval warfare but to military procurement generally, influencing post-war American military doctrine toward weapons systems that could be produced in quantity rather than exquisite platforms available in limited numbers. The program also validated the concept of distributed operations over concentrated striking power. Rather than concentrating carrier strength into a few powerful task forces, the Americans spread their carriers across multiple simultaneous operations, making it impossible for enemies to predict or counter every threat. This distributed approach acquired more total platforms but provided operational flexibility that concentrated forces couldn't match. The concept would resurface decades later in discussions of distributed lethality and networked warfare. For the Japanese admirals who had scoffed at escort carriers in 1943, dismissing them as auxiliary vessels incapable of affecting the war's outcome, the vindication came far too late. By the time Japanese naval leadership recognized escort carriers as the strategic threat they represented, there was no capacity to respond effectively. Japan lacked the industrial base to build carriers in equivalent numbers, lacked the fuel to operate them if they'd been built, and lacked the trained pilots to fly from them even if fuel had been available. Admiral Onishi, who'd studied those reconnaissance photographs in November 1943 with growing dread, survived the war only to commit suicide on August 16th, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender. His suicide note referenced his responsibility for the kamikaze attacks and his grief over Japan's defeat. He never explicitly mentioned escort carriers in his final writings, but the numerical superiority they represented had been one of many factors that made Japan's defeat inevitable once American industrial capacity was fully mobilized. The story of escort carriers isn't really about ships or technology. It's about industrial capacity, strategic vision, and the willingness to embrace adequate solutions produced in quantity rather than perfect solutions available in limited numbers. The admirals who initially dismissed escort carriers weren't wrong about their individual limitations. Escort carriers were slower than fleet carriers, carried fewer aircraft, lacked armor protection, and were vulnerable to attack. Every criticism was valid on its own terms, but those critics missed the fundamental point. Escort carriers weren't meant to replace fleet carriers or engage in decisive, surface battles against enemy capital ships. They were meant to be everywhere simultaneously, providing a persistent presence that concentrated forces couldn't match. They were meant to be built faster than enemies could sink them, creating an ever-growing numerical advantage that would overwhelm opponents through sheer quantity. They were meant to free fleet carriers for offensive operations by handling the unglamorous but essential work of convoy protection, amphibious support, and aircraft transport. Of the 151 aircraft carriers built in the United States during World War II, 122 were escorted carriers. Those 122 ships carried roughly 3,000 operational aircraft at any given time, equivalent to more than 30 fleet carriers. They supported every major amphibious operation in both theatres. They protected thousands of supply convoys, preventing losses that would have crippled Allied logistics. They hunted submarines, conducted reconnaissance, provided training for new pilots, and transported replacement aircraft to every theatre of operations. The admirals who scoffed learned their lesson, but the lesson came written in the wreckage of their own fleet, the ruins of their industrial base, and the ashes of their strategic assumptions. Sometimes being wrong isn't about misunderstanding individual facts, it's about missing the larger pattern those facts create. The escort carriers were individually modest platforms. Collectively, they represented industrial warfare at its most overwhelming, a tide of steel and aircraft that no amount of fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.